everybody. Well, this is our makeup from the snow day, and we just are running out of Sundays to get all these sessions in. So we're at day 8, and we just have a few more days to go over, and this is an exciting day where we're going to look at Masada. We're going to get to go up on top of Masada. This is a picture from on top with the Israeli flag there flying. And then we're going to get to go to Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and we'll talk about those and the significance of those. This is one of the manuscripts underneath here. But then we'll also get to go out and visit the Dead Sea and float on the Dead Sea on this day. And also we'll have a short stop in En-Gedi, which is a desert oasis that's kind of attached to the Dead Sea that shows up in the Old Testament a number of times. So I'll just go over some things here today, and hopefully this will help you. Get out your note cards, make some note cards for each of these places so that when you go there you're a little front-loaded. And just a quick note, I've gotten an impression from a few folks that they're a little bit intimidated with all the teaching I'm doing. Like, do we expect you to be an expert on the Bible or on all this stuff? And that's absolutely not the case. I mean, if you don't want to do any of this front loading, that's totally up to you. I'm doing this so that when you get there, you're not overwhelmed. And the more you can know about these places ahead of time, the more meaningful it'll be. But there's no test here, and there's no quiz, so whatever you can do ahead of time just is going to help your experience. But you would have an awesome, amazing experience if you did no preparation either. So I hope that's helpful just to clarify why we're doing these little sessions. All right, so let's talk about Masada. Here's a aerial picture of Masada. It's kind of a cool picture of it. This is where the tram goes up now, and this is called the Snake Path as it winds up. When I've gone there before, few people from each of our groups have hiked it, but we're kind of discouraging that this time because when you hike it, you'll miss all of the tour. There just isn't time. The rest of the group will get up here ahead of you, most likely. I suppose if you're really in great shape and you want to run it, and you might get up there by about the time we get there and not miss too much of the tour, but we're kind of discouraging that. But if you feel really strongly about that, we're flexible and we'll get that figured out. So let's talk about Masada and its significance. This is one of the 3 or 4 great fortresses that Herod the Great built. We've talked a lot about him already, and this is one that he built down by the Dead Sea that overlooks it's got an amazing view of all the area, and any invading armies, anybody coming up from the south, he would see. There would be no way you'd miss that, and so that might have been one reason why he created this fortress where he did. But as it turns out, why Masada is so famous is it's the place of the last stand of a few remaining rebels from the first Jewish revolt. Just to remind you historically, I forget the exact dates, but around 66 A.D., the Jewish zealots, those who wanted to expel the Romans from what we call the Holy Land today, or from Palestine or Judea and Canaan, lots of different names for this land. They, had provoked the Romans. The Romans had had enough, and so they begin to invade starting from the north down. We've looked at Magdala, which was destroyed in 68 A.D., and then, of course, Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 A.D. This is an event that seems to be foretold by Jesus in probably all 4 of the Gospels. And so Jerusalem is destroyed, and there's just a few people left, and they take refuge in this amazing fortress of Masada. I think the estimates are, 800 or so rebels. And these were not just soldiers, these were men, women, children. This was the community of people that took refuge there. What you're seeing in the background here is the actual ramp that the Roman army built to conquer this fortress. And this is such an archaeological interest because it shows us exactly how the Roman army in this time would do their siege works. And the reason they're preserved, because here the materials they used were the materials around, which was stone. And so it's pretty much almost the way it was 2,000 years ago when the Romans conquered finally Masada. So it's kind of the last stand. Flavius Silva is the Roman general, and we're thinking 5,000 to 8,000 siege troops, some of the elite fighting troops, and then the supportive people who, and then also slaves. The people, interesting thing, most likely the slaves that built the ramp were conquered Jewish people from Jerusalem and from the rest of the land that they forced to build the ramp, most likely, as I think I've heard the story. So the Jewish leader, Eleazar ben Jair, we're told about this story, and the reason we know this story is from the Jewish historian Josephus, and I'll say some more about him in a minute, but he's an important person to know about when you go to visit the Holy Land. And Josephus reports, and of course the story is pretty famous at this point, that when the rebels knew that their time was up, that the Romans had built the ramp and they were going to bust through the wall, and there was no way, and 2 to 6 months, I can't imagine that they got this done in 2 months personally when I just look at it, but I'm not a scholar and archaeologist. That's the estimates. I would definitely think it would be more on the order of 6 months. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. We still even have the little towns that the Roman soldiers stayed in. They built camps, which are more almost like little villages with streets in them and walls for all the tents and made of stone. And so there's been some excavation of these, of one of the camps in particular. And then, of course, Masada was excavated a good 30 years or more ago, and they found lots of interesting things. They found some of the chain metal, the protection, the armor, and some weapons and things of that nature. But there isn't much of that in the camps left because the Roman soldiers took it with them when they were done. So that's not really a surprise. But they found lots of pottery in these camps. And perhaps our guide will share some more when we're up there. But again, just a little information to front load things so you know what we're looking at. So when they knew that their time was up, Josephus tells us a pretty interesting story that they did not want the Romans to kill them or take them into captivity or slavery or abuse them or anything. And so they had a system where they killed each other until the last person, because suicide was illegal by the Levitical code and the Jewish law. So as in order to not sin in that way, they took each other's lives until the last person. Now, how would we know about this if everyone was killed, as the story goes, or as people ponder? There was a couple people who hid out, who didn't, participate in this, that then tell the story. Again, we'll talk some more about Josephus in a minute, but that's the story and why it's so famous. So we might even see some Jewish Israeli soldiers at Masada. They have their kind of entrance or swearing in ritual up there. There is also on the top of Masada, there's a room that was almost like a palace that was converted into a synagogue by this group of folks, and we know that from the bench seating around. And my first trip there was worshipers, Jewish worshipers who were up there, and they had brought a scroll in, and they read from the scroll, and they were singing songs and still worshiping in this ancient synagogue. So that it's a really fascinating, interesting place to go. I know it's going to be a highlight for a lot of folks, especially you history buffs. You'll definitely want to see that. I'll come back to the question about Josephus's report. You can see down here one of the camps, and you'll be able to see some of these from where you are on the top. This, of course, is the ramp that the Romans built. So this is one of the larger camps. I think they talk about this one as most likely the headquarters. This is a depiction of where the camps were. I think there were altogether 8 or 7 camps. Let's see, what do we got? 7 camps here. This is that big one I think we had a picture of. The front part of this is where Herod built it's a palace, but there's 3 tiers to it. I mean, it's spectacular. And then this is some of the other dwellings, and again, our guide will walk us through and tell us what everything was for and about, and you'll walk all around Masada when you do that. But when you look down, I want you to know these little squares and these very visible remains are the actual camps from when the Romans built their preparations to siege Masada. You might also wonder, why would they go to such bother for just 1,000 or 800 Jewish rebels? Couldn't they just wait them out? Well, you'll also see when you're there, let's see what I got with the next picture. Well, this is one of the camps, a close-up, and then this is from the top, at one of the paths that you walk to, and then a picture of the Dead Sea from the top. This is the 3-tiered palace, what it would have looked like in that day, and then this is a picture from the top, and you can walk down into, you know, this area, the lower part of the 3-tiered palace, and the guide will explain a lot of that, but we'll get to see that. And I'm just trying to see if I had a picture here that might help me back up. So the reason they decided to invade, more than likely, is you can't see them here. There's a little, maybe this is a little evidence here, but an elaborate system of cisterns were created, and where they had the little trenches and the little aquifers, I guess you could say, tiny little drains that would capture all the water when it did rain, and then they had these huge cisterns. One of them is estimated to be enough drinking water for 1,000 people for a year, and there were like 7 or 8 of these. So they had plenty of water, they had plenty of food. This was all fortified by Herod the Great, and so they could get all the food they wanted to up there, and just the system and the way it worked, they had plenty of water. So, and it was probably also an ego thing. You know, the Romans, they had defeated the Jewish revolt except for this one little bastion of holdouts, and, you know, they just couldn't let that go, I imagine. And so they went to great expense to finish these Jewish rebels off in the first revolt. So that's more about Masada, and you'll hear a lot more, and you can read a ton if you want to do more than this, but this gives you a little quick way to write a note card and write some facts and interesting things. I want to talk a little bit about Josephus, since he is such an important figure, and he's certainly the one that tells us about this event. So you should know a little bit about who Josephus is. This is known as a Jewish historian, who is contemporary with the first Jewish revolt, the time of the, maybe I think he's taken into captive by the Romans when they begin to invade from the north, so that would be 66, 67 AD. Don't quote me on those dates, but somewhere in there. He's taken he's as a prisoner when the Romans invade, and I don't know if it's because they saw that he was so well educated and whatnot, but he kind of has a switch of allegiance, and he kind of takes sides with the Romans. and is very much, even though he's a Jewish historian, very much against the rebellion, the zealots of first century Judaism. And he blames them for the destruction of Jerusalem. He doesn't blame the Romans, he blames, the Jewish revolt, the foolishness of that, and saying that, Rome would let us be fine if we would have just gone along, type of thing. And so Josephus kind of switches loyalties. He's taken out of prison, and he becomes part of the Roman establishment. And so he writes, these histories and these books about what's going on in Rome in that time and in Palestine and the first Jewish revolt, I believe, maybe even into the second. I forget how far he goes in. But he's a person of great interest because he does make one reference to Jesus, and he makes some references to Pontius Pilate. He gives his description of what kind of ruler Pontius Pilate was. And remember back when we talked about Caesarea Maritima that they found a stone with the Pontius Pilate's name on it, so we know this guy existed. So he's taken into captivity when Romans invade, but he's freed in 69 AD, and he joins Rome. Vespasian is the emperor, and he's commissioned to write the Jewish history in 80 AD. Okay, so if Jerusalem fell in 70, he's writing around 80 AD. And his message is definitely, like I said, don't rebel, and tries to distance actual Judaism from the rebels and from the zealot movement, the militaristic Jewish sect, I guess you could say. He says true Judaism doesn't rebel that way. And so, that's kind of his motive. So by some Jewish folks would see him as a hero, some might see him as a traitor. He lives in Rome after the fall of Jerusalem, and then he writes another work a little later to champion Judaism, and that this is a fine match, it can live harmoniously in Rome. And, it's interesting that he may have been fairly successful for a little bit in that. Now, there's a lot of questions, though, by scholars about his report, even the report about Masada, but in general, anytime somebody writes history, are they perfectly objective? This is, the situation of debate. How do we know, who preserved Josephus's works? Well, as the Roman Empire becomes Christian, really for far down the line, Christians definitely wanted to preserve his works, partly because he mentions Jesus, this figure Jesus. He doesn't say who Jesus is, he doesn't say, much about him, but at least there's a mention there. And some scholars, of course, kind of maybe the hypercritical scholars say, oh, Christians certainly just inserted that in Josephus's work to legitimize Jesus. These are the types of things you get. Josephus does report other kind of mass suicides, at the end of conquering battles. And so some historians want to say this was just Josephus's mode of operation, and they doubt whether or not this story really happened with Masada. You get to decide. We'll never know. We have Josephus. We trust him or we don't. Archaeology tells us there's definitely a siege, but there's no way we can know outside of Josephus's reports whether this happened. They've done excavations at the top. They did find some human remains, but they didn't find, all of these, people. But that doesn't really take away from the story or not. That just means that they, didn't leave the bodies there. So anyway, just know that there's some debate about that, and so, but I think Josephus is an incredibly important person because he really is our only lens, one of our only lenses to this time, and certainly his telling of Masada is so important for us. The reason, of course, why I mentioned Israeli soldiers will sometimes do their, I think it's their swearing-in ceremony, or maybe it's after they've done their training, it's their commitment, is, it's a symbol for the Jewish people of their resistance against oppression and this type of thing. And so just like when we see the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum, which kind of basically gives the message, never again, this is why we need the nation of Israel, is so that the Jewish people never go through this. The Jewish people, the military goes to Masada to kind of, look at the courage of these final rebels as they resisted oppression. And so you can see the links there. So anyway, very interesting place. It's beautiful overlook of the Dead Sea. It'll be certainly a highlight. Yes, and I mentioned that the Christians preserve his work for those reasons. Okay, enough on Masada. Looking at the clock here. So we are also going to most likely take a short little trip to the desert oasis of En-Gedi. Our church group didn't go there the last time, but we have a little more time this time, and this desert oasis is mentioned in the historical books of the Old Testament, in Kings, and when David is fleeing Saul. So when Israel is formed as a nation from the 12 tribes, remember in the Samuel, it's such, 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's such an amazing story. You know, the people say, we want a king like the Philistines had, and God tells Samuel, oh, he'll enslave your kids, and but if they want a king, that's fine. And so God goes along with it, and he says, okay, they'll have a king. Well, Saul is the first king, and that does not go well. And God takes his blessing away from Saul, and he's told Samuel that he's going to anoint David as the king. And even before David is officially king, he's anointed king. And it's just, if you want to read a really great R-rated for violence and sexuality probably novel in the Old Testament, and it might be fun for you to do this before you go to Israel, read 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. That's a book within the Old Testament, within the library of the Old Testament. And so if you read 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, you'll get to this point where David is fleeing and running for his life from Saul. Saul knows his time is up, God's pulled it, but he's not going to go without a fight. And so he tries to hunt David down to kill him. And one of the places David hides out and finds refuge is it mentions in the Old Testament, En-Gedi, this desert oasis. And you can see from the pictures here, this huge waterfall here. There's a beautiful water, which of course gives some vegetation here down this wash, which has some really cool, wonderful, fresh water running through it. So this was a place that's, a small army of David could hide out and, survive for a long time in the desert. And so it's kind of a fun place to go, just to see. It's a nice little walk, and you can take your shoes off and put them in the nice cold water, or if you cool yourself off. Of course, we're there at the end of March, and 1st of April, so it may not be as hot as when I was there with this trip and this pictures, which was in June. So anyway, it's a beautiful place. He takes refuge there. Here's the quote from 1 Samuel 24, 15, 29, so you can check that out and look that up if you'd like. Now let's get to, then we're going to move to Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we'll finish off the day by getting a chance to float in the Dead Sea. This is a little selfie there with the famous Cave 4 in the background, which is very visible from the spot where you can overlook onto where some of the caves were. Let me go back here. This is a little close-up of Cave 4. Remember this cave because I'm going to talk about it a little bit. How many scrolls did they I think it's estimated just under, I think it's like 900 or 1,000 scrolls from this one cave. But this is Cave 4. It's not the first cave where they discovered the scrolls. And so I'll tell you that story now and why it's important and why why we're going to go there. As the story goes, shepherd boy, these nomadic folks who were taking care of the sheep, um, goes hunting for one of his animals and stumbles across this cave, and while he's in there, he looks down and he sees these jars, and he goes in, and evidently he takes some writings that were in these jars. They're made of animal skin, these particular ones, and why they were so well preserved. And of course, why else would all these scrolls be well preserved? Because it's the Dead Sea and it's so dry. Most of our most ancient biblical manuscripts come from Egypt, Upper Egypt, because it's so dry there, and most people think that's where a lot of our, because they were preserved that long. But anyway, so they take these. This is going to be a short story. It's a much more complicated story. But they basically take them, they sell them, and they start to get distributed. And some people buy them, and they don't even know, even at this point, the people that buy them don't really know what they're about. One of the scrolls is brought over and sold in the United States, and then I think it was a Jewish historian, scholar, actually then bought that. I think it was for, $200,000 or something like this, still not knowing the importance. And anyway, after numerous years, I think it was in 48 that they first surfaced, and that and then they start to figure this out by the early 50s, somewhere in there. And once they figure this out, this is a big deal. And of course, overlay this with all what's going on politically in Palestine during this time, the whole United Nations decision that there would be an Israel, and you've got and this part of the Dead Sea at the time, I believe, was under the control of Jordan. So it wasn't, the Jewish state of Israel didn't even have control over this area at the time. As things developed in Israel, this became annexed part of Israel over the various Six-Day War, I think it was, and some other conflicts. Israel kind of has, dibs of the area, and by process of elimination, people figure out that that these scrolls that had surfaced, these writings, had actually where they came from, and then they started to investigate. And they found the first cave, and they found more scrolls in these jars. And then, they've come up with, I think, 11 different caves. And so the way they catalog all the writings is like they'll have what cave, what document, this type of thing. But you need to understand these things are 2,000 years old. This is why it's so exciting, is because these are the oldest biblical manuscripts and other manuscripts that we have of antiquity. We have some writings that actually go way back, like 600, 700, 800 BC, but those were steles, they call them, where writing was done on stone or this type of thing. But these writings were on papyrus and animal skin. And we had known for even a long time before this of a little community that they call it Qumran, which is why, there you go, there's the name Qumran, which is just a little village town on the Dead Sea below these caves, but for thousands of years they didn't know these caves had anything in them or existed. They knew of this community, and that had been excavated. But people started to put two and two together, and this community must have been the community that was responsible then for positing all these writings up in these caves. And in these caves, we found all the books of the Old Testament. Can you imagine that? So now we have, in Hebrew, all the books of the Old Testament, 2,000 years old, and a ton of other writings. Now you remember that Cave 4, in that cave, they were not in clay jars. They were just laid there. So they were there, they were preserved, but they had disintegrated into tiny little pieces. Remember when you start a jigsaw puzzle, you dump it out on the table? Well, this is what scholars have had to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's literally taken, decades. It's taken a lot of years. So how many years are we out from that? 60, 70, 80 years from when things started. So they've been working on it all this time. All of the documents that they found to this point have now been translated, published. They're available on the internet. In my Bible program, I can look any Old Testament passage. I can see I can look at the Qumran document. So there is you should know there was a lot of controversy about, human beings in power. Who has control? Is there a conspiracy? How come these aren't being translated quicker, sooner, and all of that. I think you can really dismiss that there's been any conspiracy. It was more power control, power issues of who gets what. Israel now, and you're going to, in our next session when we talk about the scroll of the book, or the museum, the scroll of the book, I think they call it, or the museum of the book, I'm blanking out now. This great museum that Israel's built in Jerusalem, which we're going to go see, where you can see actual Dead Sea Scrolls. You can actually look upon them. They're preserved there. So Israel now has, preserved all of these, and that museum is completely dedicated to preserving the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you'll be able to go and actually see some, not at this day. You can see some replicas at Qumran. But anyway, so now all of these scrolls have been translated, published, and like I say, it's been a process over many years of people putting these scrolls back together, fitting them together, making this work. And a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls have, missing elements and whatnot. But it's the find archaeologically, textually for the Bible that there's really, pretty much ever been when it comes to the Old Testament. So it took years. So let's talk about just quickly the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls for biblical textual criticism, and why when you stand there and you look out at Cave 4, because Qumran will be disappointing. You can see the little excavations, and hopefully our guide can show us some things. By the way, they've found one of the rooms in Qumran that they're quite confident was the place where the scrolls were written. And not all of them were written in Qumran. We know from looking at the scrolls and their materials that some of them were brought there, that came from other areas, and so they were preserved. But they found a room with all these inkwells. So it's like, well, that had to be for writing. There's some struggles that they have with how that all worked in that room. But so one of the rooms there, they found, all these inkwells that, kind of tells them that these folks were very dedicated to scholarship and to preserving and passing on not only what we now call the Hebrew Bible, the books of the Old Testament, the canon, but they had all kinds of other rules for their community and all kinds of other writings, very apocalyptic, that there's going to be a battle between heaven and earth, the good and evil, and these folks, the folks at Qumran, some people think they were the people known as the Essenes that Josephus tells us about, that these folks were the people that withdrew. Even today, what do we've got? I mean, the Quakers are kind of like that, but maybe like the Hutterites or, some of those Anabaptists, we call them, traditions where, the world is so corrupt, we're just going to withdraw and hold up in our little communities. And so Qumran was very much that way. We can see from their writings they thought the Jerusalem establishment was completely corrupt and bankrupt and no good. They also, though, were not zealots. So they were very critical of other expressions of Judaism. So they were going to go out, hang out, wait for God's final battle kingdom to come. And I think, evidently, we're pretty sure that most of these scrolls were deposited before, like, let's say, 0 BC, before the time of Christ. Some people wonder, well, if they're contemporary with Jesus, because they are, this is first century material, how come they don't mention Jesus? Well, when we look at them, it's very likely that they were mostly deposited before Jesus. But Jesus, to these folks, would have been nothing, nobody to write about. It doesn't surprise me that they don't mention him at all. He would have just been some of the Jerusalem folks, or those Jewish folks that were part of mainstream society or something, and probably would not even have taken notice. It's very possible that they were motivated to put all of these scrolls up in these caves and hide them out because they kind of saw the writing was on the wall with the Romans as well. That's very likely as well. Now, let me just say a quick word about the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls when it comes to biblical criticism and analysis. So when I say biblical criticism or textual criticism, I don't mean like cutting it down, criticizing it like we talk about. It's really the study of. This is a term people use to talk about that. So when it comes to textual criticism, the Dead Sea Scrolls are amazing. So I don't have I should put something in the slides to show you, but if you can think about my left hand here being 0 AD, time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And here we are in 2019. Is it really 2019? So here we are. The oldest Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament. So the complete. It's one that's housed in Leningrad, and so they call it. I forget. It's the scroll of Leningrad in essence, and. The oldest Hebrew Bible we have, from antiquity, was around 1200 AD. So think 0, think 2019. Around 1200 years after Christ is the oldest original, or Hebrew, not original, but Hebrew manuscript of the Bible. So, also, though, with this, remember that the Old Testament was translated into Greek way back here before Christ even. I think it's about 70 BC that the Septuagint was written. That's the Greek Old Testament, and as the legend goes, the 70 scholars, that's why I call it Septuagint, 70 scholars got together. They all did their own individual translation, and they were all identical. That's the legend about the Septuagint. But it's the Greek Old Testament. Well, interestingly enough, and I won't go into too much detail on this because your head will start spinning, but we have the Greek Old Testament from way back in the 4th century, the 300s. It's part of it. It's the Christian Bible of the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, which these are two that have been found in the last 100 years. So amazing New Testament and Old Testament complete Bibles that go back 1,700 years. And they have the Greek Old Testament. So they have the Septuagint. So much older. The Greek Old Testament was much what we had. The manuscripts we have much older than the Codex Leningratus, I think is something to that effect is what they call it. All right, so you would think if the Greek one differs from the Hebrew a little bit when we're trying to make an English translation of this, well, which one would they go with? You'd think, well, I'll go with the Greek because it's got to be more accurate because it's much older. Well, here's the deal. We found now, when we find the Dead Sea Scrolls, we now have all the Bibles of the Old Testament from the Dead Sea caves at 0 AD in essence, or really probably 100 years before, because even if that's when they are put in the caves, they were probably written much earlier than that. So now we've got actual writings of the Old Testament 2,000 years old. And guess though, what happens when you compare the scroll, the Hebrew Bible that was stored in Leningrad, and the Dead Sea Scrolls? Like, let's just take the book of Isaiah. There's an entire scroll, complete scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah. They've compared it to the one 1,200 years later, and they are so similar that now, if there ever is a discrepancy between the Septuagint and the text, the 1,200 year, AD Hebrew text in Leningrad, they stick with this one, because the Dead Sea Scrolls and the 1,200 years are so similar. So what does that tell you? Well, here's the bottom line. There's a lot of people today that would say that in your English Bible, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, and I'm not going to talk about the New Testament today, but I'd love to do that over a cup of coffee. They are going to say that, oh, copies and copies of copies of copies, and we have no idea if what we have now, the text, the manuscripts that we use to make an English translation, reflect the originals at all. And most likely they were changed. Scribes made changes and this and that and this and that. Well, hey, show the evidence of that. And in the case of the Old Testament, 1200 AD was the oldest we had. Dead Sea Scrolls come along and we find that same Hebrew Bible, all the books of the Old Testament except for Esther, 1,200 years earlier, and they compare them, and they are amazed of how identical they are. That shows the precision, how these scribes meticulously copied these whole texts that they believe were holy, inspired by God, and that's why they took such care in doing it. So that's why Qumran's important. We're going to go there. You're going to be disappointed. It's just this little settlement, and you look over and you see some of these caves. In particular, you can see Cave 4 from where we'll be. But you want to be there because it's so cool. And finally then, because it's on the shore of the Dead Sea. And so hopefully, we've gone to some pretty good lengths to find a good spot to wade out into the Dead Sea and float. There's great stories about the Dead Sea from the Roman, official documents that they took a soldier and threw him out that couldn't swim because they couldn't believe that they wouldn't sink. And by gosh, that soldier floated. It's so salty. It's the lowest place on earth that you can go, unless you dig under, I suppose, way down or something. I don't know if that's happened far enough, but it is the lowest place on earth. The minerals and the salts of the Dead Sea are famous. They have therapeutic value, many people say. A lot of people come from all over the world to kind of take advantage of the healing effects. A few warnings about the Dead Sea, and you'll get these warnings as well. It is so salty, like this guy here. I think he's really pushing it. He's got his hands probably on the bottom. You never want to touch your head, your face, your eyes once you're in the water. It is so salty, if you get any water in your eyes, you won't be able to open them. They'll burn so bad. Now, that happened with somebody that was in our group last time, and I just helped them out of the water. There are showers right, by where you get in, and then you just rinse off real well, and things were fine. But it will kind of end your time in floating in the water if you, scratch your head and some of the water drips down. So you just got to be careful about that. And also, ladies, I'm told it's good not to shave your legs the day of because they will burn. And if you have a cut or something like that, it'll hurt, but it's not that It's not that bad. So you will be instructed about how to get out into the Dead Sea. And this person up here is perfect. You know, you can just kind of lay back and you will float on top. You'll bob like a bobber. And it's actually a cool experience. It's getting harder and harder now because the Dead Sea is shrinking. The Dead Sea is dying. And Jordan and Israel are working very hard together to do something about that. Why? Well, the water isn't getting there because it's all being used upstream. Sea of Galilee is fine. It's still a great place of fishing and all of this, but through irrigation and other things, so much water is being used that the Dead Sea is kind of dying, and they're working on that. What you'll also find out, though, interestingly, is Israel is the forerunner of desalination plants. And they have a number of these, and they're hugely important for Israel because water is a big, big deal, as it is in all of the Middle East. And so they've done some technologies that are unparalleled from what I'm told. And so there's some thoughts about how can we pump water into the Dead Sea, and I know it's being talked about. I have no idea where that stands. So we'll finish the day with some time in the Dead Sea. You'll be able to shower there and get cleaned off as we then head back to Jerusalem for dinner. So there you go. That's this day. It's going to be a great, historical, interesting, wonderful day. God bless, and we'll see you soon for our next session.